The M14 rifle is a common sight in many video games and war movies. A wooden battle rifle from a bygone era, used in a limited capacity still today. But not many people know about its tumultuous beginning. Nor do many know of its questionable adoption by the United States Armed Forces. Today, I'm going to inform you about the origin of the M14, and why me, and many others, consider it to have been the wrong choice for the US at the time of its adoption. During World War II, the Germans had realized that the rifles that they had been using, such as the Carabiner 98K and several Mauser variants they had, were much too powerful for the ranges they tended to be fighting at. While they contemplated replacing their rifles with submachine guns, they came to the conclusion that fighting distances were shorter than they were equipped for, but not short enough to merit the use of submachine guns. After World War II, the Allied nations took a close look at the weapons the Germans had developed and produced towards the end of the war. Their main focus was the STG-44, a select fire rifle that fired the 7.92 by 33mm round, also known as the 792 Hz. That's when the Allied nations, and more specifically NATO, came to the same conclusion as the Germans did, and sought to create an intermediate caliber of their own. At the time of NATO's creation, the diversity of weapons and calibers across the many nations was a logistical nightmare. As a result, NATO created standardization agreements, or standards, which would standardize communications, procedures, equipment and ammunition amongst the many nations. NATO wanted every country to use the same basic rifle, and the rifle needed to be chambered in a common, intermediate cartridge. So they set up trials for all the NATO countries to submit their own attempts at a common rifle in a common cartridge. There were three main reasons NATO wanted an intermediate cartridge over a full-size rifle cartridge. Full-size rifle cartridges were overkill on most battlefields at the time. Intermediate cartridges were more controllable when the rifle was switched to automatic firing and the ammunition is lighter, meaning soldiers could carry more. There ended up being three main competitors: Belgium, the UK and the United States. Between the Brits and the Belgians, they developed a .280 British, a small, high-velocity round with manageable recoil, for the parameters set by NATO. But this is where the trouble begins. Rene Stutler was in charge of the US Ordnance Department when the NATO trials were going on, and oversaw the development of the US rifle. He was nearing the end of his career in the US Army, and was determined to make his rifle become the NATO standard. The Brits and Belgians submitted their rifles, the British EM2, chambered in .280 British, and the Belgian T48, later renamed the FAL, also chambered in 280 British. They both performed incredibly well, but the FN FAL ended up being the better contender amongst the two. The US submitted the T25 and T47, which were both essentially modified M1 Garands that took detachable magazines and were chambered in the American-made 7.62 x 51mm, a derivative of the civilian 308 Winchester round. Both the T25 and T47 performed poorly and did not meet the NATO specifications. And the reason for this? Stutler had submitted a full-sized rifle cartridge for a competition for an intermediate cartridge. When the .280 rifles outperformed the two American rifles, Stutler ignored the results and kept developing the 7.62 x 51mm cartridge, despite it not being what NATO wanted or needed. He refused to accept any cartridge that wasn't 30 caliber or above, and he threatened to withdraw the US from the Standardization Agreement. Aside from Stutler, no one truly accepted his parameters. Stutler had gunsmiths from all three countries, soldiers who had tested the guns, his own colleagues, and even officials from NATO come to him and tell him how much better the 280 British round performed compared to the 7.62 by 51mm. But to Rene Stutler, The adoption of the T-47 rifle as his legacy was more important to him than choosing the best rifle for the job. NATO was reliant on US money and couldn't have them lead, so they came up with a compromise. NATO would adopt the 7.62x 51mm round if the Americans adopted the FAL, which would be rechambered for the 7.62 round. The terms were agreed and the 7.62 was adopted across NATO. The new standard bullet was heavy, it was overkill for the ranges NATO forces were fighting at, and it was uncontrollable in automatic fire. As a result, it failed to be a proper intermediate round for NATO forces. And to top things off, Stutler compromised the NATO armament agreement, and instead of the US adopting the superiorly constructed FN FAL, they ended up adopting the M14 rifle, the culmination of the Stutler's T-47. In conclusion, Colonel Rene R. Stutler is the main reason the EM2 was scrapped, and why the development of a NATO intermediate caliber was delayed. This one man halted the progress of NATO standardization, and the development of ammunition, because he couldn't handle losing. The M14 rifle went on to perform horribly in the starting years of the Vietnam conflict, and the US Ordnance Department would go on to try and sabotage the adoption of the M16 rifle and the 5.56x45mm round. But that's a different story. The FN FAL, however, despite America's meddling, would go on to be adopted by over 90 countries worldwide. Thank you for watching my video. For now, Saving Private Wyatt, out.